The moment those police officers walked onto my property with handcuffs ready, I knew my peaceful lake cabin retreat had become a battleground. What I didn't know was that the woman who called them my HOA president neighbor had been orchestrating an elaborate scheme to steal my family's land for over 2 years. This is the story of how one phone call to 911 exposed a conspiracy so twisted, it would shock even the seasoned prosecutors who handled my case. And trust me, the final twist will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about property rights. In America, my name is Sarah Mitchell, and I inherited something I thought would be a blessing, a pristine lake cabin nestled in the mountains of Colorado. Passed down from my grandmother 3 generations ago, what I got instead was a nightmare that nearly cost me everything. The property had been in our family since 1952, long before any homeowners association existed, long before the McMansion sprouted up around the lake like concrete mushrooms. But that didn't matter to Patricia Hendricks, our HOA president, who seemed to believe that her position gave her dominion over every square foot of lakefront property. It started innocently enough. Patricia moved in next door about 3 years ago, immediately installing herself as HOA president in an uncontested election. She was the type of woman who measured her neighbor's grass with a ruler and sent passive-aggressive notes about mailbox colors. But I kept to myself, spending weekends at the cabin with my teenage daughter Emma, fishing and hiking, staying out of neighborhood politics. The first red flag came last summer when Patricia approached me during one of our family barbecues. She marched across the property line with that practiced suburban smile that never reaches the eyes. "Sarah, honey," she said, her voice dripping with full sweetness, "I hope you don't mind, but I've been telling the new residents they can use your beach area for their morning swims. It's just so much more accessible than the public beach." I felt my stomach drop. "Excuse me, oh, don't worry, they're very respectful people. The Johnsons, the Patel family, and a few others. They just pop over around sunrise. You're hardly ever here that early anyway." My hands clenched at my sides. "Patricia, this is private property. My family's private property." Her smile faltered for just a moment, revealing something cold underneath. "Well, technically, according to the HOA bylaws, all lakefront access should be shared for the community benefit. I can show you the documentation. The HOA bylaws don't apply to my property," I said firmly. "We predate the association by decades." That's when I saw it. A flash of genuine anger crossing her face, before the mask slipped back into place. "I think you'll find that's not entirely accurate, dear." The next morning, I woke up at dawn to find 7 strangers having a pool party on my private beach. They had brought floating chairs, a cooler, and a Bluetooth speaker. When I approached them, they looked genuinely confused. "Patricia said this was community property," explained a woman I'd never seen before. "She gave us a key to the beach gate, a key to my property that I had never given her." I spent that entire day installing security cameras and changing locks, my hands shaking with anger and something else, fear. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was calculated. The harassment escalated quickly after that. Patricia began filing horror complaints against me weekly for my non-compliant dot color, for excessive outdoor lighting, for unauthorized landscaping. Each violation notice came with mounting fines, despite the fact that HOA rules legally couldn't apply to my grandfather's property. But the breaking point came on Memorial Day weekend. I'd planned a quiet family gathering, just Emma, my sister Lisa, and her 2 kids. We were grilling burgers when I heard voices coming from the beach. Not just a few people this time. At least 20 strangers had set up what looked like a full wedding reception on my private Shirley. Me, I marched down to confront them, my sister close behind. "Excuse me, but this is private property," I announced to the crowd. A man in his 50s, wearing a polo shirt and entitlement-like expensive cologne, stepped forward. "Lady, we paid good money for this venue." Patricia Hendricks assured us this was available for private Events. My blood ran cold. Patricia charged you money to use my property. $500 for the day, Polo Shirt replied. Look, if there's some kind of double booking situation, take it up with her, we're not moving. That's when Lisa grabbed my arm and pointed toward Patricia's house. There she was, standing on her deck with a champagne glass, watching the chaos she'd orchestrated with obvious satisfaction. I called the police immediately, hands shaking as I dialed. The officer who responded was professional but clearly skeptical. When I explained that the whore president had been illegally renting out my property, Mom, do you have documentation proving this is solely your property? Officer Martinez asked. I did, and I showed him everything. The original deed, the property surveys, the documentation proving our ownership predated the whore. He spent 20 minutes reviewing the papers before finally asking the wedding party to leave. As the last guest packed up their decorations, Patricia appeared at my property line, no longer bothering with her fake smile. You just made a very big mistake, Sarah, she said, her voice ice cold. I've been trying to resolve this amicably, but you clearly don't understand how things work in this community. There's nothing to resolve. I shot back. This is my land. It's been my family's land for 70 years. We'll see about that, she replied, pulling out her phone. I'm calling the sheriff's department. You've been trespassing on HOA Common property and interfering with legitimate community functions. I left, but it came out hollow. You can't be serious. Deadly serious. I have documentation proving that your so-called private beach was deeded to the whore when the association was formed. You've been squatting here illegally for years. My world tilted. That's impossible, is it? Patricia smiled then, and it was the most chilling thing I'd ever seen. Why don't you check your property taxes, dear? I think you'll find some very interesting discrepancies. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by decades of family documents, searching for anything that could support Patricia's claim. Everything seemed in order until I found something that made my blood freeze. 3 years ago, right when Patricia moved in, there had been a clerical correction filed with the county assessor's office, reducing my property boundaries by exactly the amount of lakefront footage that Patricia had been claiming as HOA Common area. I had never filed the correction. I had never been notified of it. But there it was, bearing what looked like my signature. My phone rang at exactly 9 p.m. The sound cutting through the mountain silence like a knife. Sarah Mitchell, the voice was official, authoritative. Yes, this is Detective Reynolds with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. We've received a formal complaint regarding your alleged trespassing and harassment of HOA officials. We'll need you to come in for questioning tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. I stared out at the lake, where moonlight danced on water my grandmother used to say looked like liquid silver. 3 generations of my family had called this place home. Now, somehow, I was being accused of trespassing on my own land. Ma'am? Did you hear me? I'll be there, I whispered. As I hung up, I saw Patricia's silhouette on her deck, still watching, still smiling. I had no idea that in 18 hours, I would be sitting in an interrogation room, being read my rights for felony fraud and theft of HOA property. And I definitely had no idea that Patricia's seemingly perfect plan had one fatal flaw, a flaw that would ultimately bring her entire conspiracy crashing down around her. But first, I had to survive what was coming next. Walking into that sheriff's station the next morning felt like stepping into an alternate reality, where everything I'd known about my life was suddenly wrong. Detective Reynolds was younger than I'd expected, with tired eyes that had clearly seen too many property disputes turn ugly. Double quotes, Mrs. Mitchell. I want to be upfront with you, he said, sliding a thick folder across the metal table. The evidence we've been presented with is pretty compelling. I opened the folder with trembling hands, and my heart nearly stopped. There were photos of me trespassing on what was labeled as HOA Common property. There were signed affidavits from 5 different neighbors claiming I'd been aggressive and threatening toward legitimate community members. And there, At the bottom of the stack was a document that made me feel physically ill. It was a deed transfer, dated 3 years ago, apparently signed by me, officially ceding the disputed lakefront property to the Pinecrest Lakes Homeowners Association for community benefit and tax purposes. I never signed this, I whispered, staring at what looked exactly like my signature. Mrs. Mitchell, we've had it examined by a handwriting expert. The signature matches your DMV records, your voter registration, and your mortgage documents. I looked up at him, desperation creeping into my voice. Detective, I'm telling you, I never saw this document before yesterday. This is fraud. He leaned back in his chair, studying me. Here's what I don't understand. If this is fraud, why would you continue living on the property for 3 years? Why wouldn't you notice that your property taxes decreased significantly? That's when it hit me. I had noticed. 3 years ago, I'd been thrilled when my property tax bill went down. I thought it was due to some county-wide reassessment. I never questioned good news. Someone's been very carefully orchestrating this, I said. The pieces starting to come together. Detective, I need you to check something for me. I want to know exactly when Patricia Hendricks purchased her property, and I want to know who handled the paperwork. Reynolds made a note. Mrs. Mitchell, I have to ask, do you have any evidence to support your claims? Anything concrete? I thought about the security cameras I'd installed, the documentation I had at home, the witnesses who could verify my family's long history with the property. But sitting in that sterile room, it all felt impossibly small against the mountain of fabricated evidence Patricia had somehow assembled. Give me 48 hours, I said. I'll get you proof. When I left the station, I had one phone call to make. My college roommate, Jessica, was now a property law attorney in Denver. If anyone could help me navigate this nightmare, it would be her, Sarah. What you're describing sounds like a sophisticated land grab, Jessica said when I finished explaining the situation. But if someone went to this much trouble to forge documents and manipulate county records, there's got to be a paper trail. These things are never as clean as they appear. We met at her office the next day, my arms full of every document I could find related to the property. Jessica spread everything across her conference table and began cross-referencing dates, signatures, and filing numbers. Here, she said after 2 hours, pointing to a discrepancy I would never have caught. Look at this notary stamp on the deed transfer. I squinted at the tiny print. What about it? The notary commission number doesn't match the date. This person wasn't actually commissioned until 6 months after your deed was supposedly signed. Jessica's eyes lit up with the thrill of discovery. Sarah, this is definitely fraud. Question is, how deep does it go? That afternoon, we drove to the county assessor's office. Jessica had called ahead, and we were met by a clerk who looked nervous the moment Jessica introduced herself as my attorney. We'd like to review all the documentation related to the property boundary correction filed 3 years ago, Jessica said in her courtroom voice. The clerk disappeared for 20 minutes before returning with a thin file to thin. This is everything we have on file, she said. Avoiding eye contact, Jessica flipped through the pages, her frown deepening. Where is the survey documentation? The witness statements? The property owner notification records? I'm not sure. Maybe they're in a different file. No, Jessica said firmly. They should all be here. Who authorized this boundary change without proper documentation? The clerk's face went pale. I'll need to check with my supervisor. We waited another hour before the supervisor, a tired-looking man in his 60s, came out to meet us. Ladies, I'm afraid there seems to have been some irregularities in the filing process 3 years ago. We're launching an internal investigation. Jessica leaned forward. What kind of irregularities? The kind that suggests someone with inside access may have manipulated our records. My legs went weak. Inside access, the person who filed the boundary correction had administrative passwords to our system. This wasn't just document fraud. This was a coordinated effort involving someone with privileged access to county records. As we drove back to Jessica's office, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Has Patricia ever mentioned having any connections to local government? Any friends at the county office?" I searched my memory. She did mention something once about her ex-husband working for the county, but I assumed it was just casual conversation. We need to find out more about Patricia's background, and we need to do it fast, because I have a feeling tomorrow's deadline ain't arbitrary. That evening, I sat in my cabin, staring out at the lake that might not legally be mine anymore, when my security system alert went off. Someone was on my property. I pulled up the camera feed on my phone and felt my blood freeze. It wasn't just someone, it was Patricia, accompanied by two men in suits, walking around my property with measuring equipment and cameras. I grabbed my keys and ran outside, my heart pounding. "What are you doing on my property?" I shouted as I approached them. Patricia turned with that same cold smile. "Actually, dear, we're on HOA property. I'm conducting an assessment for the insurance company." "Insurance company?" One of the suited men stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm Jim Stevens from Lakefront Development Corp. We're the new owners of this parcel. We took possession as of 5 p.m. today." The world started spinning. Took possession. Patricia's smile widened. "I tried to handle this quietly, sir, but you forced my hand. The HOA sold the property to cover your outstanding fines and legal fees. It's all perfectly legal. You can't sell property I own. Property you don't own," she corrected. "Haven't owned for 3 years. Actually, check your email. The eviction notice was served electronically hour ago." I stood there in the growing darkness, watching strangers document every inch of my grandmother's property, feeling more helpless than I'd ever felt in my life. But as I turned to walk back to the cabin, possibly for the last time, I remembered something Jessica had said. These things are never as clean as they appear. Patricia had made one mistake. In her rush to close the deal and get me off the property, she'd moved too fast. And in doing so, she'd finally given me the proof I needed. Because according to Colorado law, even if the property transfer had been legitimate, there was a mandatory 30-day waiting period for any HOA property sale. The eviction notice was dated today. The supposed property transfer was dated 3 years ago, but the sale to Lakefront Development was dated yesterday. Someone had just made a very expensive error in their timeline, and tomorrow, Jessica and I were going to use the error to blow this entire conspiracy wide open. The real question was, how many other properties had Patricia stolen using the same method? And more importantly, who was helping her do it? The emergency injunction hearing was set for 9 a.m. on a Thursday morning that felt like the most important day of my life. Jessica had worked through the night, and the evidence she'd uncovered was more explosive than either of us had imagined. "Sarah," she said as we walked up the courthouse steps, "what we're about to reveal in there is going to destroy more than just Patricia's little scheme. Are you ready for that?" I thought about my grandmother, who taught me to fish on that lake when I was 7. I thought about Emma, who'd been planning to bring her own children there someday. I thought about how many other families Patricia might have targeted. I'm ready, Judge Patricia Morrison, ironically sharing a first name with my nemesis, was known for her no-nonsense approach to property disputes. She listened to Patricia's attorney's opening arguments with a stoic expression that gave nothing away. "Your Honor," Patricia's lawyer, a slick-looking man named Richard Cale, began. "This is simply a case of a former property owner who refuses to accept the legal transfer of land she voluntarily deeded to the Homeowners Association 3 years ago." He presented the forged documents with theatrical confidence, walking the judge through Patricia's manufactured timeline. I watched Patricia herself, sitting behind her attorney with perfect posture and that same serene smile, looking like the picture of suburban respectability. When it was Jessica's turn, She stood slowly and approached the bench with a single manila folder. Your Honor, before we address the validity of any property transfer, I'd like to present evidence of criminal conspiracy, document fraud, and racketeering that goes far beyond this single case. The room went silent. Even Patricia's smile faltered for the first time. Mrs. Chen, those are serious allegations. Judge Morrison said, I hope you have substantial proof. I do, Your Honor. Jessica opened her folder and removed a thick stack of documents. Over the past 72 hours, we've uncovered evidence that Mrs. Hendricks, working with at least one accomplice inside the county assessor's office, has systematically defrauded at least 7 other property owners using identical methods. The color drained from Patricia's face. Jessica continued, we've also discovered that Lakefront Development Corp., the company that supposedly purchased Mrs. Mitchell's property yesterday, is actually a shell company owned by Patricia Hendricks herself. Richard Kell jumped to his feet. Objection. This is completely outside the scope of this hearing. Overruled. Judge Morrison said, leaning forward with obvious interest. Continue, Mrs. Chen. Your Honor, yesterday evening Mrs. Hendricks made a critical error. In her haste to finalize what she believed was her successful theft of my client's property, she violated Colorado's mandatory 30-day waiting period for HOA property sales. But more damning than that, Jessica paused for dramatic effect. She used her administrative access to the county computer system to backdate documents in real time. Jessica handed a document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. This is a forensic analysis of the county's computer logs, showing that the deed transfer supposedly signed by Mrs. Mitchell 3 years ago was actually created and filed last Tuesday at 3:47 p.m. Less than 1 hour after my client first contacted my office. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Patricia was no longer smiling. She was whispering urgently to her attorney, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Judge Morrison studied the document carefully. Mrs. Chen, are you telling me that Mrs. Hendricks had unauthorized access to county records? Not unauthorized, Your Honor. She had completely legitimate access through her position as a county planning consultant, a position she failed to disclose when she moved into the neighborhood and began targeting properties adjacent to hers. The final piece of Patricia's perfect facade crumbled. She wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was a county insider who'd been using her access to systematically steal lakefront properties for resale. Furthermore, Jessica continued, we have security camera footage from Mrs. Mitchell's property showing Mrs. Hendricks conducting unauthorized surveys and bringing potential buyers onto the premises before any sale was legally finalized. She nodded to me, and I stood to activate my laptop. Connected to the courtroom's display system, the footage began to play. Patricia and the supposed buyers walking around my property, measuring, planning, discussing renovations as if they already owned it. But the most damning moment came when Patricia's voice, clearly audible on the recording, said, don't worry about the current occupant, she'll be gone by Friday. I've already processed the eviction through the county system. The timestamp on the video was from 2 days before the supposed emergency sale to Lakefront Development. Richard Kale was frantically shuffling papers, clearly trying to salvage an unsalvageable situation. Your Honor, my client may have made some procedural errors, but the fundamental property transfer remains valid. Jessica smiled. Actually, Mr. Kale, it doesn't. She pulled out one final document. This is a handwriting analysis conducted by the state's forensic laboratory. The signature on the deed transfer is a sophisticated forgery, created using computer software and a digital signature pad. She handed the report to the judge. Mrs. Hendricks' ex-husband, County Assessor Tom Hendricks, provided her with access to Mrs. Mitchell's signature samples from tax documents, voting records, and other county files. Using the information, she created a digital forgery good enough to fool a casual inspection, but not good enough to pass forensic analysis. Judge Morrison looked at Patricia with undisguised disgust. Mrs. Hendricks. Do you wish to make a statement? Patricia stood slowly, her perfect composure finally cracking. Your Honor, there seems to have been some misunderstanding about the scope of my consulting work with the county. Mrs. Hendricks, the judge interrupted. I'm going to stop you right there and suggest you speak with your attorney before saying anything else. Because based on the evidence I've heard today, you're facing not just civil liability, but serious criminal charges. She turned to address the packed courtroom. I'm granting Mrs. Mitchell's emergency injunction. All property transfers, sales, and eviction proceedings related to this matter are hereby null and void. Furthermore, I'm ordering an immediate freeze on all assets of Lakefront Development Corp., and I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for Criminal Investigation. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. But as we were packing up our materials, Richard Cale approached our table with a look that made my stomach drop. Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Mitchell, he said quietly, I think you should know. My client isn't the only one involved in this scheme, and the people above her in this organization are not going to be happy that you've exposed their operation. Jessica frowned. What are you talking about? Check the ownership records for Lakefront Development Corp. very carefully, he said. The name you'll find at the top is going to surprise you. He walked away, leaving us staring after him. That afternoon, Jessica ran the corporate filing records for Lakefront Development Corp. When she called me with the results, her voice was shaking. Sarah, you need to sit down. What did you find? The primary shareholder of Lakefront Development Corp. isn't Patricia Hendricks. It's Judge Morrison's husband. The room started spinning. The judge who had just ruled in our favor, whose husband stood to profit from the very fraud we'd exposed, would now have to recuse herself from any further proceedings. Everything we'd accomplished in court today could be thrown out. Jessica, I whispered, what does this mean? It means this conspiracy goes higher than we ever imagined. And it means our fight is just beginning. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Patricia's cold smile in the courthouse hadn't been defeat. It had been the confidence of someone who knew that no matter what happened in that courtroom, the game was rigged from the very top. But she had made one crucial miscalculation. She thought that exposing the corruption would discourage me. Instead, it had just made me angrier than I'd ever been in my life. 3 months later, I sat in a different courtroom, watching Patricia Hendricks being led away in handcuffs. But her arrest was just the beginning of the most shocking conclusion I could have never imagined. Recusal of Judge Morrison had triggered a federal investigation that unraveled a conspiracy spanning 5 counties and involving dozens of stolen properties worth millions of dollars. What started as my simple fight to keep my grandmother's cabin had exposed the largest property fraud scheme in Colorado state history. Judge Harrison, Morrison's replacement, was a federal appointee with a reputation for being absolutely incorruptible. As he read the final verdicts, the courtroom was packed with victims, lawyers, FBI agents, and reporters from 3 states. Patricia Hendricks, Judge Harrison announced, on 17 counts of property fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering, this court sentences you to 12 years in federal prison and orders full restitution to all victims. Patricia, no longer the perfectly composed HOA president, looked small and defeated in her orange jumpsuit. But I knew the real story was just beginning. Thomas Hendricks, the judge continued, addressing Patricia's ex-husband on charges of conspiracy and abuse of public office. This court sentences you to 8 years in federal prison. But the biggest shock came next. Margaret Morrison, Judge Harrison said, his voice heavy with disappointment. Your corruption of the judicial process represents a fundamental betrayal of public trust. This court sentences you to 15 years in federal prison. Judge Morrison, the woman who had initially ruled in our favor, had been arrested 2 weeks after our hearing when FBI investigators discovered that her apparent support for my case had been a calculated move to appear impartial while Her husband's company prepared to legally purchase the disputed properties from the HOA after a suitable waiting period. The plan had been diabolically clever, appeared to stop the fraud, let the heat die down, then complete the thefts through her husband's shell companies using proper legal channels. If I hadn't pushed for a complete investigation, they would have succeeded. But the biggest revelation was still to come. As the courtroom began to empty, FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres approached me with a manila envelope. "Mrs. Mitchell, there's something you need to know. Something that changes everything about how this started." I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a property survey from 1987, 15 years before my grandmother's death. "Your grandmother knew," Agent Torres said quietly. "She knew someone was planning to challenge your family's ownership of the lake property. Look at the date on this survey. The survey was commissioned by Eleanor Mitchell, my grandmother, and it clearly established that our property boundaries extended 50 feet further into the lake than even I had realized. She had also filed a quiet title action that same year, creating an ironclad legal barrier against exactly the kind of fraud Patricia had attempted. But why didn't she tell us?" I asked. Agent Torres smiled. "Because she also commissioned a private investigation into who was behind the threats to your property. Look at page 3. I flipped to the indicated page and felt my heart stop. There, in my grandmother's careful handwriting, was a note. Patricia Henderson, maiden name, daughter of Dale Henderson, attempted to purchase property 1987, refused sale, suspect she will return with different approach, have secured property legally in perpetuity for family protection. Patricia hadn't moved next door by coincidence 3 years ago. She had been planning this theft for over 30 years. Ever since my grandmother refused to sell to her father, your grandmother left specific instructions with her attorney." Agent Torres continued, "If anyone ever challenged your ownership of this property, you were to receive this envelope. She'd been protecting you from beyond the grave." I started crying then, for my grandmother's foresight, for the justice that was finally being served, and for all the families who had lost their properties before we could stop this conspiracy. But Agent Torres wasn't finished. "Mrs. Mitchell, we need your help with one more thing. We believe Patricia and her network targeted properties across multiple states. We've identified at least 47 families who may have been victims of similar schemes. Would you be willing to help us contact them?" I looked out the courtroom windows at the mountains in the distance, thinking about my grandmother's lake cabin. My lake cabin, where Emma and I would be having dinner tonight. "Absolutely," I said. 6 months later, I stood on my dock watching the sunrise paint the water gold and silver, just like my grandmother used to describe it. Emma was asleep in the cabin, dreaming of her senior year and college applications. My phone rang. Another family whose property had been stolen. Another case where my story and evidence could help bring justice. I testified in 14 similar cases so far, helping recover over $8 million in stolen property. But the sweetest justice came from an unexpected source. The state of Colorado used the recovered assets from the conspiracy to create the Eleanor Mitchell Fund for Property Rights Protection, named after my grandmother. The fund provides free legal assistance to families facing fraudulent property challenges. Patricia Hendricks is currently serving her sentence in federal prison. Last month, she sent me a letter through her attorney, offering to settle remaining civil claims if I would accept partial responsibility for escalating the situation unnecessarily. I threw the letter away without finishing it, because sometimes justice isn't just about winning in court. Sometimes it's about protecting the next generation from predators who believe that power and position put them above the law. Every morning, I walk down to my grandmother's dock, my dock, and I think about how many families are sleeping peacefully tonight in homes they almost lost to fraud. I think about the reforms that have been implemented in county assessment offices across 3 states. I think about the FBI task force that now specifically investigates property fraud schemes, and I think about Patricia, sitting in a concrete cell, finally understanding that some things can't be stolen. No matter how perfectly you forge the paperwork. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is my land. It was my grandmother's land before me, and it will be my daughter's land after me. No HOA Karen, no matter how well connected, no matter how sophisticated her scheme, is ever going to change that. If someone is trying to steal your property, your home, or your family's legacy, don't back down. Get a good lawyer, trust the evidence, and remember that the truth always leaves a trail, even when that trail leads to places you never expected to go. Have you or someone you know been targeted by fraudulent property schemes? Share this story and help protect other families. Justice isn't just about individual cases. It's about stopping these predators before they can target their next victims.